Thank you for your time, Ms. Diaz. Appreciate you being here this morning to testify. Thank you so much. Next question or next witness, Mr. Spinella?
I see Joseph here. Should we try him again, or Joseph, can you speak and just see if your internet is working a little bit better?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Keep going. Let's see if it's working.
Can you hear me better?
Not really.
Okay.
We'll come back to you again.
I could give my testimony that I signed up for Senate Bill. Pardon me?
Sean, we'll come back to him. I think he's still having issues.
Yep, that's fine.
Christina, who do we have next in here? Hold on one second. Trying to find out who's next. All right, we have Callie Hellman.
Hi, good morning. It's Callie Heilman. Hello, Senator Fonfara, Representative Scallon, Senator Martin, Representative Cheeseman, and all the distinguished members of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. My name is Callie Gail Heilman, and I live in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I am the president and co-director of Bridgeport Generation Now, which is part of the Recovery for All Coalition. I am testifying in strong support of HB 6187 and SB 821. For those, if you don't know, Gen Now is a member-based grassroots organization in Bridgeport. We organize to end systemic racism and corruption in our city so that we can have the just, equitable, and livable city we know is possible. In July of 2019, our Public Safety and Police Accountability Committee held a space where community members gave testimony on their experience with violence and misconduct within the Bridgeport Police Department, and were able to speak their truths directly to our now former police chief and other members of the Bridgeport Police Department. At this forum, a Bridgeport resident who is both a probation officer and a mother spoke deeply about the fear she holds for the safety of her 18-year-old Black son who has autism. In her words, "He has an invisible disability, and I'm concerned about officers dealing with Black and brown children who have invisible disabilities because they will become combative, non-compliant to a simple request. What are you doing?" We all know her fear is justified. The deaths of Daniel Prude, Patrick Warren Sr., and our own Mubarak Soliman, who was killed by a Connecticut state trooper, show us that armed police responses to mental health and substance abuse crises can end in tragedy. In fact, in last week's Judiciary Committee hearing, we heard from Brian Presleski, the New Britain state's attorney, who affirmed that, quote, "introducing a firearm into a volatile situation turns that situation deadly." To transform our society and create a system of public safety that keeps us all safe, we must shift our perspective, our policymaking, and our budgets, and how we fund them. We must look at public safety through a public health lens and make strong investments in addressing the root causes of community violence, like mental health, substance abuse, underperforming schools, high cost of housing, lack of healthcare, and more. Bridgeport currently has no structural mechanism in place for people needing mental health services when police are called. With the progressive revenue proposed in HB 6187,
This is your 30-second warning. 30 seconds.
We can fully fund the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Service mobile crisis intervention teams to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week statewide, dispatching trained mental health professionals to all 911 mental health calls instead of an armed police response. Think of passing HB 6187 and SB 821 as a form of reparations for the deep damage that systemic racism, classism, segregation, over-policing, and underfunding has done to Connecticut's Black, brown, low-income, and working-class communities. Thank you for your leadership and commitment.
Thank you, Ms. Heilman, for being with us today. We appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Mr. Agley, is the fourth time the charm, my friend.
You want to try him?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Try turning your camera off, Mr. Agley. Sometimes that makes the connection work better. And now just unmute yourself and you should be good to go, hopefully.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Agley.
Okay. I have testimony for proposed Senate Bill 171. My name is Joe Agley and I reside in Kent, Connecticut. I'm opposed to Senate Bill 171. Now is not the time to be increasing taxes. The state will be the recipient of 10 million of federally assisted COVID relief. Money in this package will be used to aid struggling states and cities, many of which have been in fiscal danger for years, such as Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven. Governor Lamont has stated against any new taxes. What do some other authoritative sources have to say about tax raises used to target so-called wealthy? Well, a Pioneer Institute of Massachusetts has said raising of tax 3 times on wealthy in 2009, 11, and 2015 has caused high-income earners to leave the state, not solving any budgetary issues. Source B, Internal Revenue Service. Connecticut has a net loss of more than $12 billion in adjusted gross income between 2012 and 2018 due to outmigration. 64% of that loss has come from those earning over $200,000 per year. Source C, Yankee Institute for Public Policy. The last state estimate revenue being in January 2021 indicate Connecticut this year will have a surplus of roughly $70 million due to revenue increases tied to Wall Street
Your
gains,
30-second warning, Mr. Agley. 30
tax, and the
seconds.
cutting of expenses. The state's balance in the rainy day fund is over $3 billion. It cites a $2.5 billion deficit to the pandemic. Now, getting back to the American Rescue Relief bailout, a $10 billion figure is the amount Connecticut will receive. This was cited by Congressman John Larson. Aside from stimulus checks and unemployment funds, $6 billion will go to the state of Connecticut's needs. From there, $130 million goes to municipalities and cities. We've gone from a property tax credit to a conjured up new tax foisted upon mid to upper level taxpayers. Senate Bill 171 is simply wrong and is not needed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Agley, for being with us this morning. Apologize for the technical difficulties if that was on our end, but we hear you and we appreciate your testimony this morning. Thank you very much.
That's my finished testimony.
Thank you,
All
sir.
right, next up, we have Representative Michael Winkler, and from what I understand, he is joined by David Gandish. So Representative Winkler.
I don't see Mr. Oh, there he is. Okay, go ahead, Representative.
I will yield my time to Professor Gamage, who's a specialist in, or is a professor of law and a specialist in tax policy at Maury University.
Thank you. I'm, as said, a professor of law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law and a national expert in tax law and policy. I served in President Obama's Treasury Department and on state-level tax reform commissions, and I regularly advise state governments on tax reform. I am testifying in favor of proposed bills 6187 and 821. Connecticut's economy is unbalanced. It has been for decades, increasingly so, and the pandemic has greatly magnified these imbalances. For decades, the lion's share of economic gains has gone to the wealthiest few and most profitable corporations, while ordinary workers and families have suffered. This has been even more so during the pandemic. Again, the wealthiest few have prospered, most successful corporations have flourished, while ordinary Connecticut residents have struggled. The tax and spending measures being considered would go a long way to addressing these imbalances, to helping ordinary Connecticut individuals and families. These measures would help restore fairness to Connecticut's tax system, which is currently regressive, meaning it harms the overall fiscal balance of Connecticut's economy and tax justice in Connecticut's economy. Moreover, the proposed measures being considered would have minimal impact on investment by corporations in Connecticut, by the wealthiest in Connecticut, minimal impact on migration by all studies that have considered a robustly migration in response to tax hikes or tax changes, would have very small, the revenue raising measures would have very small impacts in Connecticut's economy. By contrast, giving ordinary Connecticut residents financial assistance would greatly increase investment in Connecticut's communities. Giving ordinary Connecticut's a financial assistance, financial boost, would keep struggling businesses afloat by increasing spending in Connecticut's economy and communities. It would make it possible for ordinary Connecticut residents to build new businesses, to invest in themselves, their communities, and business throughout Connecticut. Again, Connecticut's economy is unbalanced. This should be addressed. The overall balance of measures here would go a long way to restoring tax fairness and encouraging investment and positive economic activity in Connecticut's communities. I'd be very happy to answer any specific questions any of you might have about any of the measures, either as part of this hearing, which I expect there won't be time, but I'd also be happy if any of you wanted to contact me afterwards, but I do see hands.
Thank you, Professor. First up, Representative Chafee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for speaking with us today. I was just curious, on the last economic downturn, the Great Recession, a lot of states tightened their budgets and underinvested. Do you see that as a good path forward during this current downturn? And could you talk a little bit about the effects of states tightening their budget during economic downturns?
Yes, absolutely. Many studies, the balance of research has shown that it is very harmful for states' economies to cut during downturns needed spending, needed services during downturns or otherwise. Even for those who think that changes in states' economic balance of spending needs to be done over a long run, to do that suddenly as a response to a downturn has been shown to be very harmful for state economies and steady over steady. On top of all that, this downturn, the pandemic, has worked differently than the prior two major downturn economic cycles. In the prior two downturn economic cycles, the states with the highest income tax rates had troubles as income tax rates revenues declined during downturns. Those revenues skyrocketed again during upturns. So cutting income tax rates was harmful to those states. Later on during upturns, it stopped the eventual recovery. But during this downturn, income tax rates have been what has been keeping states afloat. It's been the states with the highest income tax rates, like California, that have actually done the best in recovering from the early stages of this pandemic. And that's again because in this pandemic-inspired downturn, the wealthiest individuals and families have been doing very well. The most profitable corporations and largest businesses have been doing very well. And it's the ordinary Main Street economic activities that have been suffering. And cutting needed state spending services, cutting jobs, cutting assistance to local communities where that spending is needed is the worst way to deal with any budget problems that might arise from the pandemic.
Thank you. One of the most common arguments I hear against raising taxes on the wealthy or corporations on the state level is that they're just going to flee the state. I was just curious, have you done research into this, and is there data to either back that up or to counter that argument?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, when we're talking corporate tax side, the corporate tax revenue raising mechanisms, including the digital tax, it's important to understand that Connecticut, like most states, has a single sales factor system. That means moving economic activity out of Connecticut in no way affects a large corporation's corporate tax bill, or in no significant way. Connecticut has a destination-based business tax system, meaning it's where spending happens that generates the tax bill. So it's actually putting money in Connecticut's communities, so spending happens that increases corporate tax revenue. It's not like the federal level location-based or source-based corporate tax system. So any arguments about corporate—
You have 30 seconds remaining in your 5-minute question and answer.
Any statements about corporate taxes are just based on misunderstanding. On personal taxes, there's been many high-level academic studies on mobility responses in relation to tax hikes. None of these studies by any sophisticated academics or in peer-reviewed journals have found more than minimal mobility responses. In other words, raising personal income tax rates, it's possible a handful of wealthy folks might move, although there's no evidence in support of that on a high level. There's very large evidence that if any mobility responses happen, it'll be small and a very, very small impact in Connecticut's economy.
Thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you wouldn't mind, if you could send me some of that information, I would greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely, it'd be my pleasure.
Representative Ferrara.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Professor. Thanks for being with us in this remote environment. A question for you, I think for all of us, we've been paying very close attention to the details as they've come out of the federal government with the American Rescue Plan. And, certainly there's a lot of conversation on how that fits into so many of our state and local needs with this crisis. But one of the things I think myself and many others are trying to figure out is, my understanding is that, those dollars, are very specific to COVID relief and need to be spent down, in the next couple years. And I'm trying to kind of grapple with, how those fit with where we need to go in reducing our inequality. So can you kind of explain a little bit of, how would these bills that are proposed around, reducing our regressive tax policy really be even more necessary associated with this rescue plan?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the question. A few months ago, I was talking with many state governments and state legislative officials about emergency responses to prevent dramatic slashing of services and other bad responses to a downturn. The recent federal legislation makes that much less necessary, maybe not necessary at all. But the longer term underlying problems that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, where ordinary Americans, ordinary Connecticut residents and families have been suffering, where the lion's share of economic growth has gone to the 1% and the fraction of the 1%, and the largest, most profitable corporations instead of being spread widely, that's continuing unabated. Very little of the recent federal reforms will address these longer-term imbalances that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. This is a great opportunity in these bills to address these longer-term imbalances, to address the imbalance in Connecticut's economy that's leading lion's share of economic activity to be concentrated at the top, that's preventing opportunities for those at the middle, those who are struggling to try to have their chance to create new businesses, to create investment opportunities for themselves, to invest in education for themselves, their kids, their families. Economic growth for ordinary Americans, for ordinary Connecticut residents, takes money, takes opportunity, and that money, those opportunities aren't there in the middle and in the bottom. The measures being considered would help address this, and I believe would have very positive short, medium, and long-term effects for Connecticut.
Thank you, Professor. And are there any particular, kind of on the flip side, are there certain taxes or tax incentives you think we should avoid to ensure kind of as robust recovery for all as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could it's hard to know how to answer a question like that in a very short time frame. But I'll pick out Connecticut, like every state, uses a large portion of its corporate tax revenues and revenues in general in location-based incentives for large businesses competing against other states. There's a large literature on these location-based tax incentives. Almost entirely, this literature finds that this money is wasted. I hear, as I talk to many states, calls for doing more of this type of wasted stuff during these times, and I would urge you to resist those calls. For sure, large businesses are going to go after any money they can get when their lobbyists are very sophisticated, but the literature suggests they're going to go after this money for investments they're going to do anyway, and these location-based incentives don't actually create new investments in states like Connecticut. They just add more resources to businesses that were going to invest in the ways they were anyway.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Chairman.
The Vice Chair, Representative Kavros DeGraw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this point, where would you say that spending would have the most impact in order to get our economy going?
I consider myself an expert in tax policy, revenue raising policy, which clearly has relationships to spending. I don't know that I'm the best situated to say what's the best way to spend resources. I will say there's a large body of research supporting both of the following propositions. One, that lessening tax burdens or otherwise putting money in the hands of ordinary Americans, Connecticut residents, and struggling lower income families has large beneficial economic effects. And there's many portions of these bills that would have those effects, including especially perhaps increasing the earned income tax credit, which has been shown to have very beneficial economic effects. Additionally, I'll emphasize again that cutting needed services during a downturn has been shown to have very negative economic effects. And again, even if you think that there should be reform of services provided by the state over a medium or long run, which I don't feel is in my area of expertise, cutting services, cutting jobs, especially state worker jobs in response to budgetary pressures during a downturn has been shown to be among the worst coping mechanisms, among the worst responses in prior downturns that has magnified negative economic effects for states and local communities.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Representative Nuccio.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. And Mr. I'm sorry, your last name is Gamage?
Gamage, please.
Gamage, hi, how are you?
My pleasure.
So I think you would be happy to hear that this governor actually stopped doing incentives for businesses to move to Connecticut and made them incentive-based, and they actually have to create the jobs before they get the credits. So I think that's a good move on Connecticut's part. But my question was, I'm not sure I'm fully understanding. Are you suggesting that a rise in corporate taxes does not incent a business to leave the state?
That's absolutely correct. So Connecticut has single sales factor, as most states have. That means the share of a corporation's the corporate tax revenue starts with the federal calculation. At the federal level, for the federal corporate tax, as compared to internationally, works very different than state level tax systems. So for state level corporate tax liability, the starting point is the federal level, the nationwide income earned by the corporation. Then the share of that income, which is allocated to Connecticut for Connecticut corporate tax purposes, is based on sales in Connecticut. The only way a corporation can reduce its corporate tax burden in Connecticut is by selling less to Connecticut. But
well, I
raising
think
the
from a
corporate
sales tax
rate,
perspective, that may be right, but we've actually had quite a few large companies leave Connecticut specifically because of taxes and have been quoted as saying as much, that they're going to Massachusetts for more favorable tax benefits. So from a sales tax perspective, perhaps, but I find it hard to kind of reconcile what you're saying with actions that we've seen of large companies who have left and have quoted that the tax structure, they're getting a more favorable tax structure in Boston or in other areas than what they currently have here in Connecticut. So I'm having a hard time reconciling that.
The reconciliation is quite easy. The literature suggests that there's no possible tax savings from the corporate tax from relocating corporate activities as Connecticut's corporate tax is structured. Lobbyists say all sorts of things. There are other possible tax savings, such as location-based incentives, such as individual income taxes on corporate workers, but the literature suggests that these have very minimal mobility responses. That doesn't mean that corporations' lobbyists aren't going to claim that the changes they're making anyway for other reasons, for business reasons, aren't tax incentives.
Well, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I just, I understand the literature says one thing, but I think companies are actually saying another. So I understand and value the research of academia in looking at literature and that, but when we've got CEOs and such of corporations leaving and saying they're leaving for these specific things, I tend to listen to the person, not the lobbyist. But thank you for your time. And if you could send that additional information over, I think it would be worth reading. And then we can balance it with what we've actually seen here in the state. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Representative Paletta.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for the indulgence. And Professor, thank you for being here this morning. I'll be very brief. I know that we have a long list today. I was listening very closely to the testimony, and it's a little troublesome to me. Connecticut lost 6,400 jobs between November and December. We also have seen over the course of my time here in the legislature, large companies like Alexion and General Electric leave the state of Connecticut and adversely affect our economy. There was a time not too long ago when there was basically the only option was to raise taxes because we literally had that much revenue to make up, and our towns and cities were losing revenue from the state, and local budgets were increasing. Then all of a sudden, COVID came around, and we get this talk of a massive bailout for some of the states that have done a poor job, quite frankly, at managing their budget over the last several years. I look at states, and I say this every year in all of my committees, I look at states that are doing better than us. I look at Florida, I look at South Carolina, I look at Texas, I look at Arizona, and I'm encouraged to see what their economies are doing, to perhaps compare us to a state like California. I mean, I love California to go to the beach, but I don't want to be California. I say this all the time. I don't want to be California. They are a mess. And when, we hear folks like you come in here and say to raise taxes, when we've sat through this, we saw the two largest increases in state's history in 2010 and 2014. We saw the proposition of possibly adding in highway tolls and taxing Connecticut drivers. Connecticut residents are paying the highest gas tax in the nation, and now it's going up again. This is troublesome for me. I respect what you have to say, and I really welcome the discussion, and I'll listen, but I really have a problem when I hear anybody come in and try to persuade me or any of my colleagues on this committee to raise taxes even more. There's a reason why Governor Lamont has made a promise not to raise taxes this year. He has said, we are not raising taxes this year. He said it multiple times in multiple places, and I agree with him. And I really give him credit for saying that. But then we see proposals that do the exact opposite. And my fear is that there will be enough legislators to override him. So I'm hoping that that doesn't happen. My hope is that we can stick with the budget that we have and use the funds that we have. And, we don't necessarily take on a proposal that would raise taxes for middle-class families. So with that, I do have a couple of questions for you. You mentioned you're a professor. Are you actually a Connecticut resident? Do you reside here and work here in Connecticut?
No, I'm not a Connecticut resident. I'm a national expert on tax policy and here to provide expertise based both on what the academic literature says about taxation and from hands-on. I worked in President Obama's Treasury Department, served in that capacity. I've served on multiple state-level tax reform commissions, advised multiple states on tax reform. So my understanding was that the committee wanted academic expertise to advise on what they're discussing.
Thank you, Professor. And you have quite the resume, and I really give you props for that. My issue is that those of us that live here in the state of Connecticut live through the downturn in the last 10 years. We saw tax after tax. Small business owners, restaurant owners in this pandemic especially, are seeing how difficult it is to do business here in the state of Connecticut. So no offense, we lived it. And, you know, expertise is great. And I'm a big fan of research. I love it. But, you know, at times you got to come here, walk the walk, see exactly what's going on, see what the average person is saying in the small town that can't get by here in the state of Connecticut. And, you know,
30-second warning,
knock on doors,
30-second warning.
thank you. When I knock on doors in my district, the majority of people are asking me, please make Connecticut more affordable, not less affordable. But I will respect the time frame here, Professor, and thank you so much for answering the question and the indulgence. And I'll continue to listen to the debate.
Pleasure.
Representative Yacarino.
Mr. Chairman, before you go to Representative Yacarino, I just want to say that today's debate is going to, as we can tell already, engender a reaction. But no one should be concerned or afraid to come before this body to testify. This is a public hearing. All members will have an opportunity to speak their piece in their mind. Questions are appropriate, no doubt. But in terms of their positions for or against a particular proposal, if it makes its way before us for a vote, and we don't know what that will be, whether that will be or not for any bill that's before us today. But if that were to happen, every member will have as much time as they feel necessary to voice their opinion. But it doesn't matter whether a person lives in Connecticut or not. It's a public hearing and everyone has the right to come before us to speak. They will be allotted the same amount of time as everyone else, and members can question them as necessary. But we're not going to allow folks to feel like what they have to say is not something that we value. Whether we personally agree with it or not is another story. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Yacarino. You're on mute, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brief question to the professor. When you do your research in 2011, I was a freshman legislator, and Connecticut raised our income tax in different levels. We raised our sales tax. We increased many other taxes. We had almost identical deficit as Massachusetts, our neighboring state. What they did was they lowered their sales tax to one flat rate. They lowered tax almost at every level. Excuse me. They grew out of the deficit. They grew into a surplus, and we went further, spiraled down to a deficit. It's where we had to have another massive tax increase in 2013 and 15. So what is your reasoning for your academic research for that? Why would, when Massachusetts took a proactive approach, lower their income tax to 5.1%, lower than Connecticut's, lower their sales tax, lowered many fees on all people, businesses, corporations, small businesses, and individuals. They ended up gaining more revenue, just like we did in Connecticut a couple of years ago when we lowered our sales tax on boat vessel sales from 635 to I think 299. What is your reasoning for that through your academic research?
We can say a few things here. One, it's dangerous to, well, one, let's say.
No, these are the facts though. These are actual facts. This all really happened. So what is your explanation of that?
So let's start by understanding that every state has a balanced budget requirement. So it depends. So deficits mean something different in the context of state level than federal level. Beyond that, it's dangerous to reason by anecdote and specific
Representative,
circumstances.
you just allow him to answer the question, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's dangerous to reason from anecdote and narrow circumstance and specific details, which can be colored various ways. How academic research works is abstracting from the small details of specific stories and looking across larger numbers of states, larger periods of time, trying to draw out trends through statistical and other forms of research. And the research is not easy, not straightforward, and open to multiple different interpretations. But everything I've said so far in this testimony is backed up by a large body of academic research. And at this point, I've lost track of the various requests to provide follow-up information, but anyone who wants to send me an email with questions for the research underlying everything I've said, I would be very happy to provide. The specific response to Connecticut and Massachusetts during a specific period of years is not something I feel up to commenting on at the moment. I can talk about the general trends that research indicates about how states respond to different economic periods, how different types of state taxes work, and the impact on states' economies.
I appreciate that. Well, research is one thing, and I believe in it. I'm co-chair of the Bioscience Caucus of Connecticut. I love science. I love research. I love the approach to it. The fact is, facts are facts, and the fact was Massachusetts took a totally different approach than Connecticut. They looked at their past, failures of consistently raising taxes, and they saw the results of it. The results were, it didn't work. If you take too much, if I have $50 in my pocket and I only have 40, I have less money to spend. And that's a multiplier effect. So they took a different approach that they felt was going to benefit society, which it did in Massachusetts, and they've been thriving since. We took the exact opposite approach, and our economy just kept spiraling down. I'll give you one more example, then I'm done. I know we have a lot of people. Thomas Petfrey was the 31st richest man in the world. I know because my friend's his accountant. I own a shop in North Haven, Connecticut. He left Connecticut just out of principle. He came to this country with $800 in his pocket in 1980, became the 31st richest man in the world. Out of principle, when Governor Malloy was raising the income tax, he left Connecticut. We lost tens of millions of dollars a year because of that, just out of principle. So people do leave. I know we need an equity, fair equity, but we have to look at facts. Academics is one thing, but facts are facts. And the fact is, you have to have a more holistic approach. You can't just arbitrarily raise taxes. You have to see what works. And what worked
30-second warning. 30-second warning.
Done. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you, Professor, for being with us today. Obviously, you sparked a good conversation, and I'm sure that conversation will continue throughout the day. So thank you for your time. And next up, Tom, who do we have?
Yep, Mark Brault, B-R-A-U-L-T.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, sir.
Okay. If you just give me one second here, I just have to bring up what I'm going to say here. Okay. Okay, Honorable Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for my opportunity to speak. My name is Mark Bro, and today I'm testifying in opposition to SB 171. I'm a lifelong resident of Connecticut, and for generations, my family's lived here, and we've enjoyed its glory days. Now I feel pushed out, and I'm opposed to any additional taxes, and my reasons are: I've witnessed the quality of life decline for me and my children because over taxation and fees, state and federal mandates on schools have made the cost of education out of reach for most residents. The state is ranked as the least tax-friendly, and this stifles growth, leaving our children no employment opportunities, so they leave the state. Excessively large state pensions are a burden, and the recipients often relocate to avoid state taxes. The appointment of judges with high salaries and benefits for life is not necessary, as there are far more judges than courtrooms available. The consolidation of state agencies are now too large and powerful and waste tax dollars. One example is DEEP, tagging and collaring bobcats for years and bears for decades. These repetitive studies produce nothing useful for either wildlife or the residents of Connecticut. The tax increase on open space and forest, while DEEP artificially increases their value, will increase development and cause even more fragmentation of our forests. These are some examples of tax dollars wasted, and overall, what should the state be doing to repair the economy and better serve the taxpayers? The state could cut and streamline operations. The state could pursue better investments than legalizing marijuana and gambling, which would further degrade the quality of life. The state could reward businesses by offering tax incentives to create jobs. The state could look at other opportunities that require little state investment and generate huge returns. Nature tourism, for example, which could harness the state's extraordinary wildlife.
30-second warning, 30-second warning.
Right. Wildlife tourism can produce many good jobs and generate millions of tax dollars for the state coffers and income for a host of small businesses. Showcasing and conserving our wildlife can increase the quality of life in many of the most forgotten parts of the state.
Thank you, Mr. Bro. We appreciate the testimony today. I don't see any questions, but thank you again for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Yep, next up, we have Deborah Schultz.
Good morning, committee members, and thank you for this opportunity to speak about my strong opposition to Senate Bills 171 and 172. I am Deborah Schultz. I have lived in Woodbury for over 40 years and am a Connecticut native, having been born and raised in Farmington. My husband and I live in a 2,600 square foot home, which we love, but is by no means a mansion. Further, we are also both retired and living on a fixed income less than $100,000 a year. So clearly in the middle class tax bracket. The proposed mansion tax is an insult to all taxpayers. It's more accurate to call this a let's rob Peter to pay Paul tax. To expect middle class taxpayers to pay their full property tax and then be double taxed a portion by the state is reprehensible. But what is even worse about your proposed bill is the fact that you and the legislature have for years been unable to properly manage, maintain, and advance the taxpayers' money that you have received. Instead, your go-to plan seems to always be to steal more from the citizens in local towns who have been able to manage and maintain what they receive. I remind you of the $534 million bailout to Hartford a mere 3 years ago. As I say, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Your failure to appropriately manage the money you do receive should have you looking inward and asking, what can we learn from the local towns about proper management? As with any other business which is failing to maintain or advance, you should be asking, what can we do differently with what we have? I am also fully opposed to Senate Bill 172, which appears to be an extortion tax. It threatens local towns with, if you don't do this, Senate Bill 171, we will make you pay this way. It is abhorrent to me to realize that elected legislators actually think this is appropriate. Our town of Woodbury has been diligently
30-second warning, 30-second warning.
Our town of Woodbury has been diligently updating zoning regulations with an inclusion of easier access to affordable housing, which fits our town and heritage. We don't need additional threats from big city legislators. Your introduction of Senate Bill 172 is very obviously just another angle to complete the theft attempted in Senate Bill 171, and it is totally unacceptable. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. I see Senator from Farr's hand, but I just would be remiss if I didn't say something here. My wife is from Southbury. Woodbury is a lovely community. I've been there many, many times. I do not necessarily support the bills we're talking about today, though I would just say for the record and certainly for the committee that the challenges that you face in Woodbury pale in comparison to the challenges that other communities face in the state. And I think it's important for people to recognize that while you may do a great job in Woodbury, as I'm sure you do, and we do in communities that I represent too, in Guilford and Brantford, we have a little bit more resources and a little less challenges to face, and it becomes easier for us to handle our financial obligations than it does for cities that have certainly more challenges than we do. So I think it's important for us to recognize that these bills may not be the right solution to that problem, but the problem still exists nevertheless, Ms. Schultz. And I just wanted to make sure that the committee understands that I believe that there should be a distinction there that we must recognize. Senator Fanfara.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to piggyback on your comments. And my question to Ms. Schultz is, can you envision a scenario, and you mentioned several times about proper management. And I assume you mean that not just for municipalities in the state, but also probably individuals and their families. And I wonder if you could ever envision a scenario in which an individual or a town could properly manage their resources and their assets and still need the help of the state of Connecticut. Is that something that you could ever envision?
Well, we do get help from the state of Connecticut, but what that ultimately
you characterized you made the distinction, as the chairman indicated, between those towns that have properly managed their affairs and those that haven't. And I'm just wondering if you can envision the scenario where you have a municipality or a family that has properly managed with the resources that they have, but still need assistance from the state of Connecticut. Is that something that you could ever see as possible?
Well, again, I'm not sure what you're asking me, because yes, we do that there's money that comes from the state to all the towns. My opposition to this is that constantly coming back to the well of local towns who are managing their money to pay for other towns that are not, as in the Hartford bailout. We've had to pay $354 million into Hartford to bail it out. That's taxpayer money that's being used.
So
yes.
I guess the answer is no, you cannot envision that a city like Hartford, the poorest city in the state of Connecticut by far, and one of the poorest in the nation, would not need additional assistance. And if they do, it's because they did not manage their affairs properly. Is that an accurate representation of your testimony here today?
I guess I'm a little surprised about how insulting you are based on my testimony.
Well, I'm just trying to understand, Ms. Schultz, I'm just trying to understand your position with respect to you. You mentioned 3 or 4 times in your testimony about those that manage their affairs, the implication that there are those that don't. You raised Hartford twice as an example of, I assume, those that haven't. I'm just wondering if, in an example of Hartford, as poor as it is, by the way, it happens to be a town that I represent, but nonetheless, the facts are that it is the poorest city in town in Connecticut and one of the poorest in the nation. But I would assume that by your testimony that you don't believe that Hartford could use the assistance of the state, including getting assistance with respect to its debt, unless it has improperly managed its affairs.
Well, I guess my response is that Hartford is getting $534 million just from 3 years ago. And now all of a sudden, this quote unquote mansion tax is being proposed to get even more money. So I guess the question comes down to, what do you do with what you have? And can you do something better with it, rather than always coming back to those of us who are worked hard, who have been frugal, who have done what we need to do and are on a fixed income now.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming here today, Ms. Schultz. And I'd just like to take this opportunity. I appreciate the interchange between the 2 chairs, but given Senator Fanfara's comment that we have plenty of time to debate this, and we will talk about this going forward, I think trying to pin Ms. Schultz down on philosophical points falls into the same trap as you outlined before. So with that, Ms. Schultz, you said you've been a lifetime resident of Connecticut?
Yes.
Okay, and lived in Woodbury for 40 years?
Yes.
Okay, and you mentioned mismanagement, quote unquote, of state finances. In your time living in Connecticut, can you give some examples of that? I know, people talk about, oh, what with the lottery, all those things. Can you outline areas where you think we've gone astray and where the resources that were supposed to fix things didn't actually fix them?
The first thing that comes to mind is the lottery money that was supposed to go towards education. I'm a former educator, and that was a welcome kind of thing if the lottery money was going to go for that, but it never did. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. And that's a mismanagement. That's where we're saying, we're going to do this and we're going to collect the money and we're going to use that, and it doesn't happen.
And you've lived, as you say, you've lived in Connecticut your whole life. Do you see your fellow residents leaving the state? Have you yourself thought about leaving the state because of the tax burden?
I have seen many friends leave the state and go down to Florida especially, and of course, South Carolina, North Carolina. I would maybe consider it. I have family still here. I have 2 daughters, I have 4 grandchildren. And that right now is why I button up the money that I spend. I get my husband and I are very frugal. We do with what we have so that we're able to afford to stay here, to be closer to our grandchildren, which is what is most important to us.
Right. And I take it the people you've seen have not been leaving, have not been the so-called millionaires and billionaires that are theoretically the only ones who leave.
No, sadly, a lot of them are fellow educators who retire and go, as someone else said before, they leave the state, and where they don't have to pay state taxes on their pensions. So we lose friendships and we lose money.
And I believe that we were phasing out the income tax on pensions, and that's been delayed a couple of times. So I thank you for your testimony. I thank you for coming here today and taking our questions. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Representative. The representative from Woodbury, Joe Paletta.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't chime in. Thank you, Mr. Schultz, for being here, and thank you for the good work that you do for you and your husband for supporting our local community and our business community. And thank you for testifying today. I won't hold up with any questions unless you feel the need to add something more, but I know that you've been a strong advocate for small business and our economy, and I thank you for taking the time coming here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz, for being here this morning. Appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Next up, Tom.
Yep. Beryl Benson.
Good morning. My name is Beryl Benson, and I'm testifying in support of HB 6187 and SB 821. I was born and raised in New Haven, and this is where I currently live. I also have a son who has spent much of his life here in New Haven. New Haven is a city that has a lot of challenges. It is a city that needs more resources. It's not fair that some of the wealthiest in our state have so much while others have so many struggles. This inequality is not fair for our youth in New Haven who need more resources and opportunities. Better funded cities and schools can provide these programs. As a parent, I have figured out ways to find programs and extracurricular activities for my son, but there are not enough of these programs in our city, and there are far too many barriers for accessing them. Many parents cannot afford to put their children in camps during the summer and in after-school programs during the school year. Many parents do not have access to transportation to get their children to these programs, yet these parents are often working many part-time jobs to support their families. These programs decrease violence, and violence is increasing now. And we know that violence increases during and after economic crisis. So we cannot wait for more investment in our youth. The investment will save lives. It will spare families from tragedy. Moreover, investing in our youth will change their lives and move everyone forward in our state. The program spark passions that give kids focus and put them on paths to college and careers. These programs encourage kids to have more hope and plan for their future, giving more kids access to extracurricular activities now will pay off in the short and long term. They help working parents reduce violence and ultimately make our residents more successful.
Thank you, Ms. Benson. Appreciate your testimony today. Don't see any questions, so thank you so much.
Yep. Next up, Earl Gibbons.
Mr. Gibbons, are you with us?
If not, we have Kimberly Cushman.
Here, he just has to unmute himself.
Oh.
Earl.
Talking.
Good morning. Can you guys
Morning,
hear me?
Earl. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Earl Gabon, and I'm a member of 1199. I work for Southwest Connecticut Mental Health Young Adult Services Program in Bridgeport. I'm here today asking that you pass the bill 821 for the House and for the Senate, and the House Bill of 6187, that we can fund DMIS supported housing services for Young Adult Services Program. The Young Adult Services Program used to have a 16-hour step-down residential program for the young adults who didn't need the 24-hour level of care. This program focused on helping young adults gain a level of independence so that they could live on their own. It created a sense of security for the clients, knowing that they had staff to assist them if needed. It also created a sense of independence, being able to go out on their own and to take care of their own personal responsibilities. The site was staffed from 7 to 11 and it provided support for clients who needed it. Clients would check in with the staff and coordinate with the staff with any support that they needed for that day. The site has 6 individual apartments and a staff department for respite if needed. Since the 16-hour program has been cut from the Young Adult Services Program, it's been very difficult to access the level of care for our clients. The client movement from 24-hour to out in the community has pretty much stalled. Clients are being moved out into the community and they're not ready to live out on their own. Hospitalizations have increased due to the lack of support of the 16-hour site that the 16-hour site offered. The attendance and programming has declined, and the clients who move out in the community too early lack the ability to maintain their daily schedules, and you see a decline in their case management, employment and education, and other wraparound services. I ask you again to pass Bill 821 and the House Bill 6187 so that we have revenue needed to find services for sites like the 16-hour site that we have the residential
Your
program.
30-second warning. 30 seconds.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbons. Seeing no questions, appreciate your testimony today.
Thank you.
Representative Meskers.
Yes, thank you very much for your testimony. Could you clarify for me a little bit your concern in the funding? Obviously, the mission you're trying to accomplish is very important, and you're suggesting that the gap in the funding makes it hard to be successful. Could you give me a little more detail? Just I want to understand better what your concern is on it.
Yeah. So what happens is when our program is a 24-hour program. And so we have a residential component of it, and our residential clients, they, some of them don't need that level of care. They do need some care, but they don't need 24 hours. So what we had was a 16-hour site where they had the supports, but they were also able to build on their own, abilities so that they could be able to live on their own. So when that was eliminated, what we started to see was a lot of decline in the client's progression to moving out onto their own. So they tend to start to they tend to not, you can't.
They don't make progress, they regress is what you're saying.
Right, they regress, exactly. Okay. So right now, even in our program right now, there's several clients who could utilize this actual program that we had, but they're sitting on in a 24-hour site, and the level of care, it seems like they're just regressing. And so we don't have a place for them because they're not ready to live out there on their own completely, where when we put people out on their own too fast, what we find is that they end up in the hospital, or they end up getting incarcerated, or they end up just making a lot of bad decisions. And so this 16-hour site, it was something that where people were able to teach a lot of the independence that was needed, but it was also a lot of security for clients who were just not ready to just live completely on their own.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbons. This was incredibly helpful. I'm trying to chew into the issues, and if you sat through the last hour, it was a conversation of taxes, no taxes, and policy issues that they have a lot of validity. But here we're talking about it's at some level in for the penny, in for the pound. We've got a program, we've got a structure, and the question is adequate funding so we don't end up with bad results. And I think you've been tremendously, I'm glad I dragged it out of you so I could understand it. It was very helpful. So I really thank you. And thank you for showing up to testify.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbons. Next up, Tom.
Amy O'Connor.
Good afternoon, Chairman Fonfara, Chairman Scanlon, ranking members, and members of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. My name is Amy O'Connor, and I serve as the Chief of Staff for AFSCME Council 4, a union representing over 30,000 public and private employees across Connecticut. I also represent Council 4 in the Recovery for All Coalition, which is a coalition comprised of labor unions, community groups, and faith leaders. I'm here to testify in favor of HB 6187, an act concerning the restructuring of certain taxes and tax equity, and SB 821, an act concerning the reformation of certain taxes and tax equity. Connecticut has seemingly adopted a practice of austerity budgets in recent years, as well as continuing to privatize vital services in our communities. Austerity budgets have led to our state being a leader in income inequality, hobbled working families trying to get ahead, and slowed economic growth, which hurt businesses and workers alike. Communities across our state have suffered due to a lack of investment in services, which also disproportionately impacted minority communities. Despite this, the wealthiest in our state have continued to profit, as others struggle due to a booming stock market that has added billions to their wealth. During the pandemic, we have seen how excessively we tax labor rather than wealth that's accrued from the stock market. Now is the time to be bold by making investments and showing that Connecticut doesn't have to be a land of steady habits. HB 6187 and SB 821 are bold proposals that provide working families relief and raises the revenue to make investments in our communities. These bills would provide a $500 direct payment to workers laid off between March 15th, 2020 and December 31st, 2020. These type of direct relief payments would help families at a time when they need it most. This stimulus, on top of the federal payments, will help families stay afloat and have money to spend in our economy. They have to decide right now between bills and groceries. As a state, we need to be there for them so they don't have to make these horrific choices. They would also provide working class tax relief by expanding the EITC to 50% of the federal EITC. Making this change would provide long-term relief for families in years ahead and help actually lift up these working families. HB 6187 and SB 821 would also raise needed revenue that can make investments into our communities by increasing personal tax rates.
This is your 30-second warning.
Top earners and imposing a 5% surtax on capital gains, dividends, and taxable interest. The revenue raised in both bills would help universal education, provide rent relief so people avoid eviction, It would also help fund vital services at the local level, so cities and towns don't have to decide between raising property taxes or reducing services that are needed. Connecticut can address the disparities in our state by making these investments and asking the absolute wealthiest to do their fair share. Every working family deserves these investments so they can get ahead and we can come out of this pandemic together. AFSCME Council 4 strongly urges the committee to support working families in Connecticut by passing HB 6187 and SB 821. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. O'Connor. Seeing no questions, we'll move on to the next witness.
Yep, Kimberly Cushman.
Could the host please allow me to turn my video on? Thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
First of all, thank you to Senator Fonfara, Representative Scanlon, Senator Martin, Representative Cheeseman, and the distinguished members of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. My name is Kimmy Cushman, and I live in New Haven. I'm a graduate worker in the physics department at Yale University, and I am also a lead organizer of Unite Here's Local 33, the Union for Graduate Workers at Yale. I stand with thousands of members of the Yale and New Haven communities demanding that Connecticut end its austerity to cities like New Haven, and that the Recovery for All bill is passed. Living in New Haven, I see the consequences of Yale's tax exemption on the rest of the city. Yale is among the wealthiest organizations in Connecticut. Its $31 billion endowment grew by 6.8%, and its operating surplus ran to $200 million in 2020 alone. This is all meanwhile New Haven is facing a budget deficit of $60 million. Yale's economic growth in 2020 should not be a surprise. It only mirrors the portfolios of the wealthiest corporations and individuals in Connecticut. Similarly, New Haven's budget mirrors the crisis of working class people in our state. Last week, I attended a New Haven budget hearing for the next fiscal year, and what I saw was extremely frightening. The budget proposal showed loud and clear that the consequences of continued austerity from Yale and the state of Connecticut would be. For decades, New Haven's poverty rate has hovered around 25%. The government has failed generations of people living in my community. 1 in 4 people should not have to decide whether to pay rent or feed their families in one of the richest states in America. Leaders of our state who have committed to austerity and have avoided taxing the super wealthy should be ashamed that so many have been left struggling to survive. I support these tax increases on the wealthy because with the estimated net increase of $3.6 billion in the annual budget, the state of Connecticut would not only support working families in the short term with the tax breaks outlined in this bill, but could also invest long-term in our communities of greatest need. New Haven could be prosperous if the youngest generation was provided plentiful school funding. New Haven could be prosperous if Connecticut doubled down on its sustainability initiatives and trained New Haven residents to work in well-paying, clean energy union jobs. New Haven could be prosperous if we passed this bill to reinvigorate our economy and end the austerity. I would like to remind lawmakers of Connecticut that austerity is a
30-second warning, 30 seconds.
Thank you. Austerity is a choice. By paying slightly higher property and income taxes, the richest in Connecticut would be able to contribute significantly to racial and economic justice that our state needs, especially in New Haven. We can't wait any longer. Local 33 joins our allies to demand that the Recovery for All bill is passed and that the wealthiest in our state pay these proposed taxes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cushman. Seeing no questions, we'll move on to the next witness, but thank you again.
Yep. We have Abby Feldman.
Hello, good afternoon, Senator, or good morning, Senator Fonfara, Representative Scanlon, Senator Martin, Representative Cheeseman, and the distinguished members of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. My name is Abby Feldman. I live in New Haven, and I am a member of New Haven Rising and of the Recovery for All Coalition. I'm testifying in support of HB 6187 and SB 821. In New Haven Rising, we do grassroots organizing, building people power to win racial and economic justice. In Connecticut, we face some of the worst inequality in the world. Too many of my neighbors, members, and friends are in crisis. New Haven has suffered from decades of segregation. The poor neighborhoods of today were marked as hazardous or declining by redlining maps in 1937. The same neighborhoods that had the highest foreclosure rates after the Great Recession have the highest COVID-19 infection rates now. In New Haven Rising, we are working to change these maps of segregated development, and passing these bills will be important to this end. In a state as wealthy as Connecticut, poverty is needless suffering. This past election, I went to Philadelphia for 2 months to knock on doors and lead volunteers to defeat Trump. I then went to Atlanta to knock on doors for the state Senate runoff election in Georgia. I came home to New Haven to continue my community organizing efforts in the Hill and in Westville neighborhoods. I remember a conversation with a young woman in Philadelphia, Nikisha, who had described working hard her whole life to provide for her young children and her family. During the pandemic, she had been laid off and was trying to get back to school to prepare for a new job. One thing is clear from all the conversations I had with voters at their doors and returning to see the struggle in my hometown of New Haven. That is the tough economic circumstances that too many people are going through during this pandemic, and we will all be paying the price. But this struggle isn't new. Too many people have been living on the edge of economic despair even before coronavirus arrived. The pandemic has laid bare the effects of our growing inequality and has pushed too many people over the edge. The time is now for us to struggle to make sure that we have a fair and equitable state where the wealthy are expected to pay their fair share. We see the effects of inequality on our city. As I was saying, anyone who has driven through New Haven can see the demarcation between our neighborhoods and our downtown. We know that when families struggle to put food on the table, to access good jobs, to access healthcare and have quality education.
30-second warning.
It's our young people and our future that is in peril. Eventually, the pandemic will subside and many will go back to their regular lives. Many businesses will bounce back, but too many people may never recover. Connecticut residents deserve a recovery for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Feldman. Seeing no questions, we'll move on to the next witness.
Yep, James Bach.
Yes, so Governor Lamont has said that we do not need more taxes, we need more taxpayers. SB 171 and SB 172 would have the exact opposite impact, continuing to drive thousands of residents out of our state to lower cost regions. Over the last 8 years, roughly $12 billion in net adjusted gross income and 163,000 residents have left our state. Rather than leaning on a mixed bag of academic research, look at the data known and use common sense for why people are leaving. Or please ask me, as a business co-owner that employs around 100 people in Connecticut, as to why I'm not going to be investing any more money in Connecticut going forward. We have the highest percentage of net out migration over this period of any state in the country. A high cost of living, an unattractive policy mix to attract productive businesses and residents, and little comparative advantages versus other states are the primary reasons people leave. Technology changes like Zoom have enabled a remote workforce. This is a secular change. This makes cost of living that much more important in deciding where to domicile. This means we're not just competing against New York or Massachusetts, which has around a 5% flat income tax rate. We're increasingly competing in losing to Texas, Florida, and the Carolinas, among other states. Spend some time in Fairfield County if you don't believe that people are leaving because of higher taxes, or just look at what states are gaining residents and which states are losing. Whether someone identifies on the left or right, our current policy mix doesn't work. The $12 billion in net adjusted gross income we've lost since 2012, at a blended rate of 6%, could have raised $700 million for social, environmental, and criminal justice reform causes. Instead, it's just gone. Most of the arguments for these taxes center on words like fairness or equity that you'll hear throughout the day. I live in a town that sends around $200 million to Hartford and gets a very small fraction of that back. If that's not a fair amount, I want to hear concretely what is. And taxing people's homes, regardless of the price of the home, whether it's a $450,000 home or a $2 million home, is the most damaging thing that one can do to residents. Homes are the foundation of everything. It's cutting off one's nose to spite one's face.
30-second warning.
I recognize there is a problem with pilot reimbursement to our cities, and I recognize the social ills in our cities that they have to deal with that some towns don't. My suggestion would be to do means-based testing of nonprofits for property and infrastructure taxes. In New Haven, this could be additive, but recognize that New Haven's issues aren't just passive. For example, New Haven actively chose to give a $117,000 pension to their 49-year-old police chief before he got a job supplementing his income somewhere else. Clean up your own governance and budget management and stop being beholden to special interest groups for votes. Then we can get a clearer picture of where things truly stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bosch. I don't see any questions, so we'll move on to the next witness.
Yep, Josh Bivens.
Thank you so much. Thanks for hearing my testimony today. I'm Josh Bivens, a macroeconomist and the research director of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. We're a nonprofit research institute that aims to ensure the economic needs of low and middle income families are given their proper due in policy debates. I just want to make a few short points in my testimony. First, the revenue changes outlined in both HR 6187 and SB 821 would raise revenue progressively and would boost resources available to low and moderate income households in Connecticut. This is a highly desirable policy change, not just for fairness, but also because it will substantially boost economic growth in the near term in the state of Connecticut. To understand why this change will boost growth, you need to understand that the US economy has largely lost the ability to quickly self-correct following recessions, and a rapid return to economic health in recent decades has required active expansionary fiscal policy. When the economy has not gotten this help from fiscal policymakers, growth has lagged. For example, premature spending restraint at both the federal and state level is why it took an entire decade to return to the 2007 unemployment rate following the Great Recession. There's no reason why it should take several years rather than just 1 or 2 to return the unemployment rate back to a pre-recession level following a crisis. Every time this happens, even after historically steep and severe recessions, it should be seen as a profound policy failure and one that has horrible consequences for the economic security of US families. The federal government needs to be on the front line of providing this fiscal help. They have more capacity to borrow and to raise revenue progressively to support spending. And happily, they've done their job this time. The American Rescue Plan provides aid that can help state and local governments kickstart their recovery. But state governments absolutely still have a huge role to play. Even in the face of balanced budget constraints, states can smooth their spending over the business cycle. And when faced with the choice of restraining growth or cutting jobs and services versus raising revenue from high-income households and businesses, the choice should be crystal clear. Raising revenue progressively to finance the expansion of public spending and to give resources to low and moderate income families is good for growth. You are taking money from people who save more, you're giving it to people who are more liquidity constrained. That's going to boost spending growth in the near term. States, so not cutting taxes is the absolute least a state can do with the aid received from the American Rescue Plan. States need to see this aid as a force multiplier on top of the revenue they raise progressively to support public investment and provide needed services. Finally, I'd say even if a full recovery is achieved quickly following the COVID-19 recession, a decade of pronounced disinvestment by state and local governments needs to be made up. The 2010s were the decade of austerity for state and local governments. It led to needlessly slow recovery from the Great Recession and left state economies uniquely vulnerable to the COVID-19 shock. The 2020s need to be a decade of public investment if we want a better economy. The federal government has begun to lead in this way. It is time for state governments to step up and do their part as well. Thank you so much for hearing my testimony.
Thank you, sir. Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming here today. I have a question for you. So one of the problems is Connecticut has had still not recovered from the last recession has been the lack of growth in higher and income jobs. That our job growth has been disproportionately at the lower end, low-paying service jobs. And my question for you is, how are the tax policies you're proposing going to correct that problem? Because we can fix things in the short term, but unless we see a growth in those higher paying jobs, we will continue to lag the rest of the country. We will continue to not have the revenue to support the programs you want. So I'm just, you're the economist. I'd love to see how this plays into growing those higher income jobs that are the key to our recovery.
I'd say a couple things. First, I think Connecticut is not unique in the sense that its recovery from the Great Recession was incredibly slow. I think it was hit harder than most states because it was a very finance-heavy state, and finance took a really big hit during the Great Recession because it was a bursting bubble, and so it was always going to be a little tougher in that regards. I think job growth across the board will be helped by boosting demand. think demand has been what has constrained growth both nationally and at most state levels for most of the past decade. And so as you transfer resources to moderate and low income families, they spend a much higher share of the income they get. And so that boosts growth in that way. I think two last things. One, in terms of long run growth and making sure lots of high paying jobs are provided in the state, I think there are policies we can talk about in that regard. I think over the next 3 years, the real issue is going to be, do we boost demand enough to soak up everyone who wants a job in the state? I think that is the crucial priority. It's the priority we never hit nationally following the Great Recession. And so I think these tax changes absolutely help that. And then in terms of providing enough revenue, it is still the case that Connecticut has quite a bit of room to raise revenue from businesses relative even to its surrounding states. And so when I look at the constraints on Connecticut revenue over the past decade, I see those constraints more in they don't raise as much revenue from businesses as surrounding states in terms of rates and in terms of the base, rather than the growth of high paying jobs.
Well, again, just to refer to a neighboring state, Massachusetts, which has a declining income tax rate, a robust economy, certainly in terms of those knowledge-oriented jobs, and a number of programs, particularly looking at the biotechnology sector that incentivize that growth. I mean, let's face it, we can give everybody a bigger slice of the pie if we grow a bigger pie. And I suppose I don't see how this, in terms of actually writing our economic boat, provides the atmosphere, the environment in which we are going to create those jobs that then have the trickle down effect. I mean, we have a great workforce investment board, the areas where we really want to see growth, skilled manufacturing, biotechnology, all those things. How does instituting the tax policies described in these bills help toward creating that ecosystem that allows us to be the envy of New England the way we were?
I think the biggest way is it provides the resources necessary for the public investments in education, both K through 12 and higher education. We have basically priced more and more people out of affordable higher education. I think when those industries you just named in terms of being the big growth industries, biotechnology, sort of IT, those are high skill industries. We want to make sure we get as many people as possible having access to those industries. That means higher education. And so I think what we need to do is provide the resources necessary to make sure as many people as possible have that access. The number one reason why tuition costs have soared and student debt has increased enormously in the past decade is because states have cut back on that commitment to higher education. So I think in terms of the long run, you need to raise the revenue, which is what the bills do. And then on the spending side, you need to make sure it goes into public investments that will pay off in a more productive state economy.
Thank you. We could go on all day, but I'm appreciative of the limit on my time. And thank you for coming here today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Farrar, followed by Representative Chasey.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Bivens, for being here. We've heard a little back and forth just about kind of where our tax system is and what improvements we could make for the future. Given your national scope, can you give us a sense of kind of where Connecticut is in regards to our regressive tax system and why changing that now kind of is essential, as we look towards these goals, as Representative Cheeseman said, kind of for growth and recovery? Because I think for us in Connecticut, we sometimes lose sight of kind of where we sit and how regressive our tax system is. So your perspective would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you for your question. In terms of where Connecticut sits, I've looked more at where it sits in the regional economy because I think that's the most relevant place to look. And I think in terms of individual income tax rates, it looked like not an outlier in the New England economy. Where it looked noticeably like there was room to raise revenue progressively was in the business taxes. They were sort of lower than the surrounding states. I have a paper from 2018 that I'm happy to send on and have available to people. I think now is the time to do this for a couple of reasons. One, just nationwide and in Connecticut, we have an economy that's been growing more unequal over time. And so anytime would be a good time to start pushing back on that. But particularly now, when we're coming out of just a horrendous economic shock, that is going to require lots of demand growth over the next year or two to quickly bring the unemployment rate back down, to get jobs available to people who want one. And also, it's an economic shock that more than any other in history has really exploded in the low wage sectors of the economy. Like most recessions hit manufacturing, construction, sometimes finance, and then they radiate outwards. This one has gone right at the lowest wage workers in sort of face-to-face service sectors. And so now more than ever, I think not only do we want a really quick recovery that brings the unemployment rate back down really quickly by boosting spending, we also want to get resources to the people who took the direct brunt of this. And so I think at the state level, that means you have to do tax shifts, since you generally can't do borrowing the way the federal government can. And so a tax shift that raises revenue progressively from high income households and businesses and transfers resources to low and moderate income households, it not only sort of helps heal the direct damage of the recession, it is also going to boost spending in the short run. You're taking money from sectors and people who save it more, and you give it to people who are more liquidity constrained. And I think that's going to boost growth in the near term.
Thanks for walking through that. Thanks, Mr. Bivens. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Bivens, before we go to Representative Chafee, I'm going to exert my prerogative as the chair and ask you a question about what you just talked about. A lot of what we've been talking about today sort of centers around a more progressive tax structure in a goal of getting more revenue to spend it on programs. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe framing that a different way. Why would it not be a better approach to to adjust the revenue on the top end in order to offset revenue, which is obviously regressive on the lower end, by reducing taxes for the working or middle class? If we've seen study after study in Connecticut that shows that Connecticut has a regressive tax structure where folks under $50,000 a year are paying 26% of their income in taxes, whereas folks at the top are paying less than 5%, why would it not be a better use of revenue to adjust tax rates rather than change spending?
Well, some of the bills that I am discussing today do indeed reduce effective tax rates on low income households, like the EITC and issues like that. And I think that's a perfectly fine. It transfers resources to low and moderate income families, which I think is really important. I would say, nationwide and in Connecticut, the 2010s were a period of pretty profound disinvestment in public services and especially in the education sector. And so I do agree that if you're going to raise revenue progressively from high income households and businesses, I think some of it just being transferred sort of through the tax system, through the EITC, through sort of a greater exemption of income for low and moderate income families, that makes sense. I also do think public goods and services matter for the health of a state economy. And it looks to me like those trends are pretty worrisome across the board and even in Connecticut. So I would like to see some of it go to the sort of public goods and services, not just a pure tax shift. Although that tax shift, I also think should be part of the story.
Thank you. Representative Chafee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for speaking with us today. I second what the chairman stated. I do think that the burden of taxes heavily falls on the backs of working people in the state. And when we talk about tax burden, I think generally that's what people empathize with. Working people paying a disproportionate amount of their income to the state in taxes. And these bills we're discussing aren't doing that. So I think we need to be clear there. These are very targeted tax increases mainly on people making over $500,000 a year, either through income or dividends and capital gains. So I just wanted to clarify that. So a little over a decade ago, we all suffered through the Great Recession. And I know it's come up multiple times in conversation already. I know Connecticut, took basically the entire decade to recover, and I'd say we never fully recovered from that. So in your opinion, I was just curious, how is the current recession similar or different to that? And what are kind of the key lessons that we could take out of the Great Recession moving forward to not repeat the same mistakes?
So I think in terms of similarities and differences and lessons, I'd say a couple things. One, I've mentioned this before. One thing that stands out in the current recession is just how the front line of it has been very low wage workers in sort of face-to-face service sectors. The Great Recession was mostly a story of manufacturing, construction, and finance. These are higher wage sectors. Low wage workers were sort of collateral damage when everyone sort of cut back their spending. And this time, there are estimates that the unemployment rate for the bottom quarter of workers remains well over 20% nationwide. And so I think in terms of just the human damage contained in every percentage point of unemployment is higher this time because it's been such a low wage sort of centric crisis. I think the more hopeful issue is that if we manage to get the virus under control, if vaccines work the way we all hope, if there really is rapid reopening, you're going to have US families generally go into the recovery with better balance sheets than they had following the Great Recession. There was just widespread wealth loss as we tried to enter recovery from there. It was a huge headwind on growth. This time, because of the extraordinary federal aid, and because it was not a recession associated with like an asset market bubble popping, we are poised to have a potentially better recovery if we really do all the right things with policy. And I think we should take advantage of that. Like, we have some tailwinds and we should give ourselves even more tailwinds with better fiscal policy. And so I think the one big difference is the federal government response has been better, balance sheets look better. We really could have a very rapid decline in unemployment and a better recovery if we really push in that way.
Do you think any of the taxes associated with HB 6187 or SB 821 would damage economic growth? And what kind of taxes or tax incentives should be avoided to ensure we have a robust recovery?
Most of the ones I've seen in those bills do not look to me like they'd be a big constraint on growth. I am of the opinion that taxing business and taxes
30-second warning on the 5-minute question and answer.
And taxes on capital income do not have much of a sort of growth suppressing effect, especially when they're done when the economy is sort of so starved for demand the way it still is following the COVID recession. In terms of taxes that should be avoided to sort of keep growth from happening, I think in this environment, the ones I would want to avoid are ones that hit low and moderate income families more. So I would not want to see a big increase in sales taxes. That's the big one that comes to mind. I'm sure there are other taxes that hit low and moderate income families that I'm blanking on.
All right, thank you. I agree with you there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, thank you, Mr. Bivens, for being with us today.
Next up, Josh Pollock. Josh Pollock.
Yeah, hi, I'm here. Senator Fonfara, Representative Scanlon, members of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. I am Reverend Josh Pollock. I'm the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Society East in Manchester. I'm a leader with the Recovery for All campaign and a resident of Glastonbury. I speak in support of HB 6187 and SB 821. Each of you has heard desperate pleas for help from constituents during these past 12 pandemic months. Pleas from small businesses, essential workers, healthcare, nursing home, rest stop, grocery store, and domestic workers, renters, poor people, low-income people, undocumented people, teachers, students and their parents, elders, people seeking healthcare, mental health resources, addiction resources. The suffering and the need have been immense. You are also aware that most of these needs existed prior to the pandemic and are rooted in longstanding historical race and class-based disparities. The pandemic has made these disparities worse and far more visible to far more people. So we need a recovery for all, not only from the pandemic, but from these crushing longstanding disparities. The needs are enormous. Affordable quality health care, Husky for undocumented people who qualify, rent relief, affordable housing, fixing the ECS formula so that public schools thrive in every Connecticut community, closing the funding gaps for community colleges, our state university system and UConn, expanding resources for mental health, addiction and reentry services, increasing Department of Labor funding to address domestic worker rights. These are only a few critical pressing needs, and I'm sure each of you could easily identify 10 unmet social, economic, or health needs rooted in longstanding race-based and class-based disparities that cry out for funding now. You could do that without even thinking about it. And the answer, as long as we take the path of austerity, is no. And the pleas will continue. Money from the American Rescue Plan will close some gaps this year, but those dollars are temporary and will disappear in future years. They won't enable us to make the long-term investments in our communities and our people that will address decades of race and class inequity. Drawing on the rainy day fund can help, but that too is not a permanent solution. The Recovery for All campaign and our legislative champions who make up 1/4 of the legislature are proposing over $3 billion in new permanent revenues, along with tax relief for working and middle-class families. There are no tricks here. There are no gimmicks here. These are new, reliable, sustainable revenues from those who can best afford it, the state's wealthiest citizens and highest earners who have prospered during the pandemic. Friends, we can allow the suffering and the need to continue.
30-second
We can
warning.
allow the racism and the classism built into our systems to continue, or we can ask those who have profited the most to show their Connecticut spirit and pay their fair share. Austerity constrains recovery. Robust investment in our communities and our people spurs recovery for all. I think the choice is clear. I hope you agree. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Reverend. And seeing no further questions, we will go to the next witness.
Yep, Denise Weeks.
Senator Fonfara, Representative Scanlon, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Denise Weeks, and I live in Glastonbury, Connecticut. As a member of the Recovery for All Coalition, I'm testifying in strong support of HB 6187 and Senate Bill 821. This year has seen many Connecticut families on the margin struggling for survival, while others in the state were able to work from home and watched the value of their investments soar. This disparity between rich and poor in the state is nothing new, but it has been exacerbated and further exposed by the COVID pandemic. It is time that the state take bold action to ensure that those who have benefited the most from our economy, even during this pandemic, bear their fair share of the cost of recovery. The scale of this crisis demands a bold response. People are suffering, and our state has a responsibility to meet their needs. Service workers in the hotel, restaurant, retail, and entertainment sectors have lost jobs or seen their hours cut dramatically. Many are struggling to feed their families and pay their bills. Many are facing eviction. We cannot let them bear the brunt of this crisis while those fortunate enough to continue to work from home and enjoy an investment windfall bear none of the pain of the recovery. The revenue raised by this bill would provide direct payments and tax relief to help struggling families get through and recover from this crisis. Connecticut leads the country in income and wealth inequality that has long been known. This bill corrects the long-standing inequity in our tax code by ensuring that the wealthy pay a greater percentage of their income than low earners in the state. State-level austerity and cuts to the public sector after the recession of 2008 delayed recovery for years. Governor Lamont's proposed austerity budget chooses to ignore lessons made during that time and makes cuts we need, and we need to stimulate investment at this time. We cannot continue to prioritize the ultra wealthy over our state's economic recovery. The lessons from the 2008 recession is that the risk is not going too big, it is going too small. We must take bold
30-second
action
warning.
now
30-second.
or risk damaging our economy for years. With this bill, we have an unprecedented opportunity to stop the hurt so many families are feeling by funding essential services, reducing economic and racial inequality, and setting our state on a path to robust economic recovery by restoring fairness to our tax code. I urge the committee to have the courage to make the right choice and pass House Bill 6187 and Senate Bill 821. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Weeks. Seeing no questions to the committee, we'll move on.
Yep, Sheldon Tubman.
Sheldon, you sound. Hey, Sheldon, you sound like you've ingested a lot of helium, at least to me. I'm not sure if other people are getting the same noise effect, but All right, we can't hear you, Mickey Mouse, but we'll come back to you, I promise.
William Claffey.
Good morning, dear Chairman Fanfara and Scanlon, ranking members Martin and Cheeseman, and members of the Finance, Revenue and Bonding Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present testimony in support of House Bill 5182, an act concerning the cap on research and development credits. Again, my name is Bill Claffey. I'm a partner at Fiandella, Milone, and Lacera Sina in Glastonbury, Connecticut. We're an accounting firm of 85 folks, homegrown, all of our offices here in Connecticut. And I offer my background just to understand the perspective that I come from with regard to tax credits and other tax policy matters. Again, our firm is homegrown. We have 100% of our offices here in Connecticut, and we've gone from 5 to 85 employees in 19 wonderful years here in Connecticut. And just have a significant interest in not only directly, but indirectly in boosting the Connecticut economy. And I think this bill is a step toward that. The increase in the tax credit limit would allow biotechnology companies to offset the Connecticut corporate tax from currently, they can offset 50.01% of their Connecticut tax. It would increase that to 75%. And this is kind of a return to where Connecticut was a few short years ago. Before the cap was moved back down to 50.01%. It allows more mature biotechs in our state to offset Connecticut income tax to the extent that they have it, but it also allows a lot of our startup companies to offset their capital tax, which is currently being phased out. However, there may be delays in that phase out, and it's always an issue that biotechs have when they're getting significant investment, but are pre-revenue and getting taxed on that money. This increase to the tax credit limit cap would allow them to offset additional capital taxes to the extent that they have them. Our firm, we spend a lot of time with biotechs, startup businesses. We have really good relationships with Yale, UConn, and other universities in the state. And we see a lot of their P&Ls. We see a lot of their trial balances, their balance sheets. And one thing I think is true is that biotechnology companies are spenders. They tend not to be holders. It's the nature of the industry, move forward or fall behind. They spend these funds on new jobs, equipment, supplies, capital improvements, and build outs and clinical studies. All of those are feeders within our Connecticut economy. So not only are you increasing the ability of the biotech, but you're allowing companies, if those additional funds that they can get from an increase in the tax credit, allowing other companies to foster as well as their feeders of that industry.
30-second warning.
Yep. In addition to House Bill 5182, I'd like to bring up, I've spoken with Representative Cheeseman and Commissioner Lehman at DECD about potentially trying to mirror some policies in our neighboring states, specifically Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a Massachusetts Life Science Center where they tie their credits to job growth, and there's a direct ROI on that. It's a significant program. I've taken some companies through it, as much as it hurt us to have those companies in Massachusetts. But it ties job growth to job credit allocation, typically $16,000 per new job.
That is 3 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Looks like you're going to get some questions, so we're going to go into overtime here a little bit. You'll have some chance to wrap that up. We'll start with Representative Chafee, followed by Representative Yacarino.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking with us today. You could just finish your point, because I was actually going to ask if you were familiar with what Massachusetts structure is for these type of companies.
Yeah.
I know you got put off at the end. If you want to finish your point, and then if you have more questions, we can follow up.
Yeah, no, my next point was going there anyway. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So they have, they have their existing structure of tax credits, but for defined biotech companies, they have a kind of a specific set off, and they call it the Massachusetts Life Science Center. And that, in addition to providing special funds and loans and things of that nature, they have a very robust tax credit policy as well, whereby companies apply for an allocation of credits. The state allocates, I think it's currently $30 million of tax benefits. And then there'll be a round of applications that are typically due in February. The Massachusetts Life Science Organization select the companies that they want to allocate tax credits to. And then, but there's a job commitment, a job requirement commitment, new job requirement commitment. So it's a minimum of 10 employees, and the applicant must commit to that. So once they determine how many they're going to commit to, the state holds them to that, and then they offer a credit. It varies, but approximately $16,000 per new employee. And these are all good jobs. These are all folks coming out of MIT and Harvard and wherever else they're coming out of, getting paid 100 plus salaries for sure. And then once they get that credit allocation, so if you're going to hire 10 new employees, you get $160,000, $170,000 of credits. Then they've got like a laundry list of credits that you can apply those funds to. But in either way, the state insulates to some degree that credit, because they know that if they're hiring a new employee at $100,000 salary, they're going to get $6,000 or $7,000 back directly, just in terms of wages, but also all the other benefits that they're getting through capital improvement and getting their contractors up and running. And just a quick note, that program was passed by the state of Massachusetts in 2008. And if you look at kind of like, when was the surge in Cambridge and the biotech world up in Mass, most stories, Boston Globe, et cetera, will kind of point to the 2009, 2010 timeframe. And I'm sure there's some coincidence there, but I'm sure that there's not. I'm sure a lot of it directly relates to this program.
So this bill would raise the corporate tax exemption to 65%. That would be our R&D credit. What is theirs in Massachusetts?
It's very different. They have just.
It sounds like it's just structured completely differently up there. So I don't know if that's
It is. I mean, it is. It is very different in terms of their structure. They have an R&D credit. It's almost like you need to look at both things in tandem. You've got an R&D credit that a ball bearing manufacturer could get. They would be eligible for them. But then they have the biotech credit, which is if you are a defined life science company and approved, it basically gives you a kicker and a boost to get additional benefits, and those benefits can become refundable. But you have to be approved, and you have to commit.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Yacarino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill, I apologize. I got on your testimony a couple minutes late. I was on another call, but I'm a huge supporter of the bioscience field, the STEM field, engineering field. What I don't think a lot of people realize, and I think you touched on it a little, between 2008 and 2011, Massachusetts invested $10 billion between state legislature, state government, academia, and private equity. And that's how Cambridge really grew. And what I think you did touch on it, it's not just the science jobs, it's the research jobs, the tech jobs, it's the construction jobs. There's so many, you could come out of high school and get a job as a tech, and many companies will send you to go to your bachelor's degree and eventually maybe your master's degree. It's something we have tried to do in Connecticut the last 6 years, bipartisanly, through our bioscience caucus to grow these jobs. And unfortunately, a couple of years ago in the budget, there was a cut in the R&D tax credit, which many of these companies need to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, for their companies for research and development, but also to grow their companies. And in that same budget 2 years ago, the tax credit for STEM graduate students was eliminated. And we're trying to obviously reenact that. So I appreciate your testimony, but I don't think people realize, when we talk about some of these Senate Bill 821 and 6187, those bills, those might raise revenue, but the way to really raise revenue is high-paying, sustainable jobs. People that go to high school, can get a job right out of school in the tech field, or build the buildings. You need engineers, site workers. And I think we have to look at the overall picture. And that's what our neighboring state, Massachusetts, did by lowering taxes, growing those sectors' jobs. So you have any response, Bill? And I like your Ted Williams picture behind you.
Yeah, huge baseball. Representative Yacarino, you and I have talked, me through my involvement with BioCT in the past. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think, there's a lot of areas in Connecticut. I mean, New Haven is so ripe for this, right, the growth. And, the growth in Massachusetts, while everybody points to Cambridge, we have, it's moved from Cambridge. Now it's getting to Worcester, and it's getting to Springfield. And it's really, while Haven might be kind of the natural starting point, I think that once you build that ecosystem, it grows and it moves out to other areas, Stanford possibly. But yeah, I mean, and I don't know when you tuned in, but yeah, I mean, I made the comment, biotech companies are spenders. They spend money. Oh, yeah. If they don't get new resources and they're not attracting the top talent coming out of our local schools or any schools, they fall behind. And we've been, my firm, we were involved with our Vinus, and I mean, what a success story that here in Connecticut. And our current R&D credit was a big piece of,
Right.
that. But pairing that with the life science, I think really opened, well, that and the bill that's currently that I'm testifying on, that helps. I think this is just another avenue to bring more to the biotech sector.
I'll make one more comment, Mr. Chair, and I'll end it. If you look at Palo Alto, California, you look at Maryland, you look at Massachusetts, and I truly believe in all my heart that Connecticut could compete with these other states. We have great institutions of higher learning. We have a great workforce, and we are building in New Haven, Branford, Guilford, and it's going to extend. The thing about the life sciences is they love the competition. Why do you think Pfizer, Moderna, and all these companies, they're amazing what they did with the vaccine? Because it's a competition, it's a healthy competition. And men and women could go from company to company. When you have that cluster, there's so many jobs, ancillary jobs that are created through this industry. And I think as much as we have finances, this is much more important industry, not only for jobs, but for delivery of healthcare. And look at the vaccine. So we really need to embrace this and look at it at a larger, wider, long-term picture. That's all I have to say, but thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chair, both chairs and ranking members for your time.
Representative Meskos, followed by Representative Cheeseman.
Mr. Claffey, I want to thank you for your testimony. You know, we've had a lot of conversations about tax credits and the issue of whether or not it's a race to the bottom. And I understand the policy issues and the questions that we face. I think when you look at the biotech sector and you look where we are versus Massachusetts, that becomes the question is, how do we create the ecosystem or the ecosystem for the growth of the industry and get to a point where it's sustainable with the kinds of jobs it throws off. So I think I like the testimony. I think it makes a lot of sense for us to look at the industry for all the, I think the first thing you said is it throws off money, it spends money like crazy. The job levels are in the 100 to 150,000, which puts them in an income tax bracket with where they provide us with revenue to the state from the personal income tax, even with those corporate tax credits. And I think it's, if we can get to the point, and you won't finish that comment probably to me, but if we get to the point where the ecosystem is so big, this corporate tax credit doesn't become the anchor anymore. It becomes the ecosystem where you can pay a normal corporate tax rate because everybody's here and the industry is self-generating and self-feeding. And really the question is, what's the kickstart to make it significant? When I look at, you know, what I see in Massachusetts and California, which are not cheap tax states, is that they have managed to get to a nucleus where people are there and are not leaving because of that structure. And it sounds like we're nowhere near that tipping point yet. That's kind of what I'm hearing from you, right?
Yeah, I think everything helps. And, you know, I've taken, like I said, I've taken a couple clients through the Mass Life Science Center, which again, for us being a Connecticut firm, it kind of hurts us but we have to look out for our clients. And so we've taken one from a company that was single digit employees. They're now 400 employees. And so while they've gotten, you know, multiple millions of dollars of tax credits, probably somewhere in the 3 to 4 range, look at the return that Mass is getting, you know, has gotten for the last 10 years. I mean, once they got to that critical mass of 400 employees at 100, let's say $100,000 a year, obviously some up, some down, but even at a 5% tax rate, I mean, they're getting back $2 million a year annually. And that's just the one-on-one return on investment to the state. Think about all the, you know, all the contractors that were going in, that were working with them through build out, and all the, like Representative Yacarino mentioned, I mean, all the feeder industries that's serving.
And in this state, the tax rates on the mill rate for supporting local communities and all. So I'd love to have those conversations with you going forward. I think it's something we really need to lean into.
Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming here today, Bill. Good to see you again. You didn't touch on this in your testimony, but in our conversations you mentioned, because there's such a long on-ramp for many of these companies, where the tax credit may not be worth, as valuable. Can you talk about the exchange? Because I'd like to put that on the exchange of tax credit. So I'd like to put that on the radar of the other members of the committee.
Sure. Thank you, Representative Cheeseman. So currently, and kudos to Connecticut. I from an R&D tax credit, just looking at that in isolation, Connecticut has, and I work with, that's what I do. I do multi-state taxes, and credits are a part of that. Connecticut has a fantastic